Welcome to my 273rd video on my work with OO gauge. This video will feature two Keyser kits for 7-plank end-door LMS open wagons. I will be building the kits, decorating the finished wagons, and running them on my Hornby 2-rail layout. Spoiler alert, these kits were difficult and time-consuming to build, with one being in worse condition and requiring much more corrective work than the other. If you watch this whole video, of course, you'll be able to see all of the details. Here are the kits as I received them. I bought these two kits from eBay UK, which meant that with the shipping to me in Canada I paid more than they were really worth. But I'd never tried a Keyser kit before and I wanted to see what they were like. I don't know why the packaging identifies the kits as being for private owner wagons, as they are fairly obviously specifically for LMS company wagons. Although private owner wagons from the same diagram did exist. I wanted to confirm some details about the prototype wagons, especially as regards markings, so I looked the type up in R.J. Essery's fairly definitive illustrated history of LMS wagons. I'm pretty sure this is the correct type, the standard 7-plank mineral wagon fitted with an end door. Many of these wagons were built starting in 1924, shortly after amalgamation created the LMS. The left-hand page seen here shows the wagons as they were first finished, with no diagonal white stripes on the sides. The practice of adding the white stripes was introduced quite shortly after, so most of these wagons would have been seen with white stripes. The right-hand page seen here shows the next evolution of finishing in grey with diagonal white stripes and large LMS lettering. It's interesting to see one of the wagons with a side door open and a load of barrels, not what you'd typically think of these wagons carrying. These next pages illustrate the progress of changes to the markings. Note that, as clarified at top left here, the purpose of the white stripe was to make obvious which end of the wagon had the end door, the high end of the stripe being at the end with the door. Around 1937, the LMS switched from painting wagons grey to painting them bauxite brown. Around the same time, or a little before, there was a switch from using large LMS letters in the centre to using small LMS letters at bottom left. The stripe was also eventually reduced so as to be painted only on the side panel nearest the end door. Since I prefer to model LMS operations in the 1930s, I would expect to finish these wagons in grey with a full white stripe. Here are the contents of the first kit after unpacking. A single sprue of grey plastic parts for the wagon body, cast white metal parts for the axle hangers and brakes, turned brass buffers, and metal wheels on metal axles with blunt ends. There was a single sheet of instructions printed on one side. Here's a close-up of the white metal parts. These proved somewhat problematic, especially in the case of this first kit. Here you can see the entirety of the instructions, a line drawing of how the side of the wagon might be finished, and some very basic verbal directions. The illustration and associated painting instructions are based on how the wagons were finished by the LMS from shortly after production started in 1924 up until changes in colouring in lettering around 1937. Here's a close-up just of the verbal instructions so you can read them in their entirety. As directed, I started with the plastic parts for the wagon body. I cut them from the sprue and cleaned them up with an emery board. When I tried the fit of the wagon ends against the sides, it was not good. The flat surfaces at the bottom prevented the parts going together to form a proper seam along the join. I filed down the flats at bottom to allow the parts to join better. Here you can see that flat surface at the bottom of the end of the side after I filed it down to allow the wagon end to fit better. With that done, I was able to glue the ends and the sides of the body together with poly cement. I glued the ends and sides together in 2 pairs. Note that the 2 ends are quite different. The end at left here is the end door and so fits square against the side, whereas the other end at right here is fixed and glues to the sides with beveled edges. Then I glued those 2 pairs together. Note that the end door is at left here, the end with the beveled joins at right. I dropped the floor into the wagon body. It didn't make a tight fit, in fact there was quite a bit of play. I glued the floor in place with poly cement. Here's the bottom of the wagon at this point. The sole bars are included in the castings for the wagon sides. There are pins and tabs on the inside of the sole bars for fitting and positioning the white metal parts. Here's a look back at the instructions. We're now supposed to fit the brake gear and then fit the axle hangers with the wheels pivoted between them. This was where I ran into a fairly fundamental problem with this kit. The white metal axle hangers didn't really have any holes into which the ends of the axles could be fitted. I measured the axles and got out a drill bit just a bit larger. I tried to drill holes in the axle hangers. It wasn't very hard to drill the white metal with a pin vise, but it was tricky to judge how deep the holes should be drilled, and they needed to be large enough to allow the axles to turn when inserted into the holes. You can see the 4 axle hangers here after I attempted to drill them out. At this point I turned my attention to how the buffers would be fitted. They were supposed to go into holes at either end of the buffer beams, which were cast into the parts for the wagon ends. You can see the holes on either side here. But only one of those holes actually went through to the other side. I should really have caught this and fixed it before assembling the body parts. I drilled out the incomplete hole using just a small bit in a pin vise. Then I opened up the hole the rest of the way with a knife blade. The white metal brake parts were supposed to fit over the pins on the inside centre of the sole bars, but they wouldn't fit as the holes in the white metal were closer together than the plastic pins. I was able to get one side to go on by squeezing with pliers, but there was no way I could get the other side on. So I used a small round file to open out the holes in the white metal towards the outside so that I could get them over the plastic pins. With that done, I was able to fit the brake parts into place and I glued them with CA. The axle hangers were then supposed to fit up against the sole bars with one end tucked in between the sole bar and the brake part and the other end up against the tab at the end of the sole bar. They did fit like this reasonably well. I used a file to remove flash from the axle hanger parts to make them fit better. However, I still had critical problems. If I fitted one axle hanger and then fitted one end of an axle into the hole in that hanger, the other end of the axle came much too far over to allow proper fitting of an axle hanger on the other side. As you may see here, if I tried to fit the parts like this, the axle hangers were going to be leaning outwards at a ridiculous angle. I tried drilling the holes in the axle hangers deeper than I had before. By this point I had pretty significant holes in all of the axle hangers, but I still couldn't fit them properly. The axles made the hangers too far apart for them to fit inside the sole bars. There didn't seem to be any point trying to complete the assembly of things like this. I tried some plastic wheels with pinpoint ends that were on my bench left over from a previous kit build. Those were also much too wide to fit between the hangers. I checked the gauging of the wheels provided with the Kisa kit. This had nothing to do per se with the axle hanger fit problem, but I wanted to make sure that the gauging was correct before attempting to modify the axles. I felt that the gauging as it came was a bit too wide, as seen here, and I re-gauged the wheels to just about 14 millimeters. I resorted to grinding down the ends of the axles with a grinding stone in a rotary tool, as I couldn't see how else I was going to get them to fit. It looked as though this approach should work, but I was going to have to take a bit over a millimeter off each end of each axle. After shortening the axle ends, I did my best to round off the ends with the grinding disc. I managed to just about get things to fit like this with the axles still turning, although the axle hangers were still leaning outwards a bit. Next to be fitted were the brake levers, which came as white metal parts to be glued in place with superglue, to the sole bar at one end and the bottom of the brake hanger at the other end. The fit of these levers proved somewhat problematic, as there wasn't much surface for the glue to hold and they kept falling off again. Here's the bottom of this first wagon with all of the kit parts fitted except for the brass buffers. Before fitting the buffers, I wanted to do something about couplings. No coupling fittings were included with the kit. I figured that my best bet would be to fit these parkside coupling mounting blocks, which should then allow me to fit couplings of the type with a horizontal bar with holes at either end. I got out 2 coupling mounting blocks and 2 Bachmann couplings. These were the only couplings with this type of fitting that I had on hand at the time, and they proved less than ideal for these wagons, as you will see. I glued the coupling mounting blocks in place inside the buffer beams using polycement. Next, I wanted to fit the buffers. The instructions said to screw the brass buffers into the holes in the buffer beams, but the first buffer that I tried had no thread on its stem. I drilled the hole out a bit so that the buffer stem could fit in. I checked, and 3 out of the 4 buffers supplied did have threaded stems. I guess the one at bottom left just missed the thread cutting process somehow. I selected a suitably sized drill bit to help with fitting the buffers. I was able to screw 3 out of the 4 buffers supplied into place. I used CA glue to hold the buffer with no thread in place. Then I fitted the couplings to the coupling mounting blocks. The assembly of this first wagon was now essentially complete, although obviously more work was required on finishing the wagon. But I figured that I'd best test the wagon first to see if it would actually run like this before starting work on painting, marking, etc. So I railed the wagon up on my Hornby 2-rail layout. I coupled the wagon up behind a Bachmann Midland 1F. The wagon was able to couple to this loco because the loco had a nice long coupling on the back, but clearly there was an issue with the couplings on the wagon, as the very long brass buffers protruded out past the loop of the wagon coupling. I could get the wagon to go round behind the loco okay like this. But if I tried to couple up another wagon fitted with the same type of couplings as the Kieser kit, it wouldn't work well, as the buffers lock together and the coupled wagons couldn't really get round curves without derailing. Here you can see the front of the wagon coupled to the loco on a curve. This works okay because the loco has short buffers and a long coupling. But the coupling to the wagon doesn't work well, as the couplings pull the wagons too close together so that the buffers lock against each other and prevent the wagons from turning relative to each other. I got the parts for my second Kieser kit out. All of the same parts as for the first kit were provided. There was some flash on the plastic parts, and also, as seen here, some holes didn't go all the way through, as with the first kit. In this case, all 4 brass buffers did have threaded stems. And in this case, the axle hangers had great big holes going almost all the way through them, so the ends of the axles were able to fit very deeply into the axle hangers. Almost all of the axles outside of the wheels fitted into the holes in the hangers. One of these hangers still didn't have as deep a hole, and I drilled that one out. That's the one that's seen at left here. So in this case, fitting the axle hangers and wheels was much simpler than it was with the first kit, as with the large deep holes in the axle hangers, it was possible to fit the axles and hangers between the sole bars without further modification. And the hangers ended up straighter on this one than I managed to get them on the first one, even after all my modifications of the first one. With two of these wagons built, I tried to couple them together, and it was simply not possible. The buffers were so long and the couplings so short that the coupling hooks couldn't reach the coupling loops at all, even when the wagons were aligned straight. It would be extremely difficult to usefully modify the brass buffer parts, so as far as I could see, this problem could only be eliminated by fitting longer couplings, or entirely different buffers. I didn't have any other suitable couplings on hand, so I left things like this for now. I have ordered some alternative longer couplings to help get around situations like this. Concerned about the coupling issue and also not sure how well the wheels would run, I tried the two wagons out on my Hornby two-rail layout. As they wouldn't couple to each other, I coupled another wagon between them, but as you'll see, I had to find a different wagon to couple between them before I could actually get this train to run well without derailing. Okay, I haven't finished these two Keyser kits for 7 plank wagons at all, but given the problems with very long buffers and short couplings, I thought we'd try and see if I can actually persuade them to run with anything. See, that one's better than anything else. It's, because it just has long some of them have long couplings on. But the only couplings I've got in stock that will fit more or less are those Wagon ones that are fairly short. So if I couple these two 7-plank kit-built wagons together, they wouldn't go around a bend at all, because the couplings are... But they wouldn't even couple. You can't even get the coupling hooks to go on to the bars because the buffers are too long. Anyway, let's see if this will go round without derailing or whatever now. This is the Wagon Midland 1F weathered by the Model Centre, which is one of my favourite, possibly my actual favourite little engine. It's just such a nice little engine. Well, they're wobbling a bit over the... I did re-gauge the wheels. Ooh, I think the wagon between the two of them's come derail. Yeah. Well, that's not very good, is it? Okay, I'm going to try again, but now I've put a wagon. I don't know, you probably can't see really, I think down there, but this wagon has the thin, long, modern type of couplings on it, as does this engine. So they seem... These wagons seem to couple up better with those, basically just because they've got a long coupling hook on them, so you can couple without having so much problem with those long buffers. So let's see what we can do here. So the problem is the way they're made up now with those Wagon wide couplings on them. They're very picky about what else they'll couple up with. If you couple them to things with nice long couplings, I think they will just about work, but they won't couple to each other, and indeed they generally don't like coupling to things that have those Wagon wide couplings on, which is a bad thing because they're pretty much my standard couplings for kit-built engines, so kit-built rolling stock. So, but they don't work well with these particular wagons because of the long buffers. At this point I felt that I could live with the running of the wagons, even though the coupling situation wasn't ideal, and I turned my attention to completing the finishing of the wagons. I masked the ends and sides to allow me to spray the interiors. I spray painted the insides of the wagons brown. Masking over irregular surfaces often results in paint running where it's not wanted, and this case was quite bad. Because this tends to happen, I try to remove the masking tape before the paint is fully dry. I cleaned up the excess paint with mineral spirits on a cotton bud. Next, I needed to deal with the white stripes wanted on the wagon sides. I didn't have any wagon decals that could do this for me, so I wasn't clear how I could manage it. I tried masking one side of the wagon, and then painting over the masking with white acrylic. This really didn't work at all, it just made a complete mess. I used some isopropyl alcohol to clean off the white paint from that failure before it had a chance to fully dry. This was acrylic paint. At this point, one of the brake levers fell off. As I said before, there just wasn't a lot of surface by which to glue these on. It occurred to me that I had a large stock of assorted decals somewhere in the basement left over from my many years of building display models of planes, ships, etc. I sorted through these old leftover decals for things that had large white segments. These decals were left over from a plane kit. I figured that I should be able to make something suitable for the diagonal lines on the wagons from the white parts available here. I cut out a straight piece of white decal. Then I cut that to an appropriate length and split it in half lengthwise, which I thought should just about provide what was needed for the stripes on the wagon sides. I applied those waterside decal pieces to the sides of the wagons, using some microset to help. I wasn't really happy with the way those decals sat on the wagon sides. I figured that they needed to be snugged down more into the grooves of the planking, etc., so I very gently applied some Solvaset to the decals. Solvaset makes me a bit nervous, as it really quite violently dissolves decals. You also can't buy it anymore in Canada, which likely means it presents a health hazard and should be handled very carefully. The Solvaset actually did a pretty good job in this case of snugging the stripe decals down into the irregular surface of the wagon sides. Next, I used some flat black acrylic paint to paint the sole bars, axle hangers and brake parts. I cut some pieces of foam and fitted them into the wagons as starters for loads. I got out some HMRS press-fix decals for LMS wagons and selected some large LMS letters. I applied these press-fix decals over the stripes on the wagon's sides. It would likely have been ideal to break up the stripes where they went over the letters, but I couldn't see how I'd manage that, and it doesn't always seem to have been done historically. Here's the side of that wagon after the removal of the press-fix backing. I got out some Model Master waterslide decals for wagon running numbers. The press-fix decals include numbers, but only as individual digits, and making up 5 or 6 digit wagon running numbers from tiny individual digits is just a monumental pain. So I used these decals, which gave complete numbers. I have to admit I didn't worry too much about the exact running numbers. Next, I wanted to complete the loads. I spooned some Woodland Scenics coarse grey ballast over the foam pieces in the wagons. Then I wetted the loads with isopropyl alcohol and then soaked the loads in watered-down white glue. After the glue on the loads dried, I masked around the bottom of the wagons so that I could spray matte acrylic fixative over the wagon bodies without gumming up the axles and couplings. Here are the wagons back after the clear matte acrylic dried. This should protect the decals. I got the finished wagons back onto the layout for a bit more running. Okay, let me see if I can just give you a last look at these Kiza wagon kit built LMS 7-plank mineral wagons. Been quite a big project to do, this has, because of the difficulties of the kits and the finishing requirements. I've got them coupled up as before. This is not focusing, is it? Between the middle and 1F, and then I've got a flat wagon between them, and then another wagon behind them. But the critical point is that all those things they're coupled to, that kit-built wagon behind, the brown wagon between, and the 1F, those all have long, narrow couplings on them. Because basically that's all that these wagons will work with. Their own couplings are really too short relative to the buffers. They won't couple to each other, and they won't couple to anything else with short couplings. You need a long coupling to get to buy that. I've ordered some longer couplings now, but I didn't have anything else in stock. I had some NEM long couplings, but I didn't have any long couplings for this kind of fitting. Anyway, let's just see these wagons running now if we can. They do basically run, I think, famous last words. They might wobble a teeny bit more than they did before the fight, when I last tested them before the final finishing, because since I put loads in now, they're a little bit more top heavy. But then those loads don't weigh a lot, they're just made up out of woodland seed mix ballast, which is not particularly heavy. But it's not really stone, I don't think, unlike the express ballast, which actually is stone, ground stone, so it's quite heavy. So there you go. I think they're quite nice looking wagons now, but they were a lot of work. And, you know, I fully appreciate that my finishing of them is less than perfect. I wish I'd done a slightly better job of, various things, but still, they're not too bad. There you go.